So good evening, good afternoon. A very warm welcome to everyone. Here we have Masterclass devoted to the pandemic, which is a general term that we have today. And I am here pleased to have colleagues from the COBS, which is the Council on Business and Society, which is composed of several business schools working together. So it is a premiere also for us in order to have this kind of joint appearance and see how it goes on. So we have 4 colleagues joining me. So my name is Cédomir Nestorovic, and I'm a professor at ESSEC Business School. I'm located on our campus in Singapore. But with me, we have also Tom Gamble. So Tom Gamble is very instrumental in the COBS, and it is due to him that we are all present here because he contacted all the different schools in order to have this kind of nice event. So Tom will be the MC for this hour and a little bit more, and he will explain you how we are going to work. Tom, it's up to you.
Thanks very much, Cédomir. Yes, hello everyone, and thanks for logging in. That's great to see you. So how will it work today? We have 5 prestigious professors from 5 leading business schools throughout the world. I'll introduce each professor, and each professor will have 10 minutes to speak on a given theme, based around the global theme of the new normal, new dawn or new dusk. We'll finish off with Cédomir at the end. And of course, if you do have any questions, please send them through, and we'll pick up on these questions at the end, and hopefully engage in a very exciting debate. Please don't hesitate to stretch these guys. The more you stretch your brain, the better it gets, and the more interesting it gets. So without further ado, Professor Gonzalo Garland, IE Business School. So you're a professor of economics, you're VP Strategic Global Partnerships at IE, you're an executive member of IE University, and you have an illustrious list of deanships. So you studied in Peru, Stanford, and Pennsylvania in the US. And what's interesting about you is that you can give us perhaps a historical perspective of international convergence and divergence, and perhaps talk a little bit about protectionism. So over to you.
Sure. Well, first of all, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you joining us from different parts of the world. And it's a real pleasure to be in this event of the Council on Business and Society, and with all these esteemed colleagues from other business schools. So being an economist, as it was mentioned, I was thinking about doing more of a more historical and long-term, in a way, perspective. So in 10 minutes, I'm going to try to explain some very important, what I think are important features about the world in order to come to the present situation and think a little bit about the future, what this whole situation might tell us about the future. So in those terms, let me start by talking about some studies that have been made by the most renowned economic historians that show that really for centuries, the world was very much equal from the point of view that everybody was equally poor. For centuries, per capita incomes were really between $400 and $600 per person per year everywhere in the world. And there was not really significantly more advanced regions than others. And this was all the way, this famous book published in 2008 was very much the situation for centuries, all the way to really the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution produced something that some historians have called what's called the Great Divergence. Initially, this was mentioned later on by Samuel Huntington, but there's a book by a very famous economist, Kenneth Pomeranz, that talks about how the world really diverged, how the world really became like 2 different worlds. The Industrial Revolution, because of technological change, made these advanced countries, usually initially in Europe, but also in North America, really diverge in kind of 2 worlds. It was a much more industrial world, very advanced with high per capita incomes. You can see exponential growth on per capita incomes. And suddenly the rest of the world was left behind. Later on, actually, and this was from the beginning of the 19th century all the way up to really the 1950s. After the Second World War is the first time we start seeing other actors that were not like North American or European, basically catching up. And that was the first one, was really Japan. It was after Second World War, was Japan. Then it was the Asian tigers with a more outward looking strategy. And that's of course Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Korea, and then China starts reforming in the 1970s and the 1980s, going to a more open kind of a relationship with the rest of the world. And that starts catching up. That I also tell sometimes my students, you don't realize how important these recent decades have been. If you go to the 1990s, so many things were happening in the 1990s, no? Collapse of the Soviet Union and the opening of Eastern Europe. India starts reform after a crisis of balance of payments, Latin America after a lost decade. And that marks or accelerates a trend that is really what is called the emerging world. We all hear about emerging world and emerging countries and China and India and Brazil and Russia, et cetera, but we don't realize that that has not been a trend that has been there for centuries. It really is a relatively recent trend. No? So what I'm trying to go in here is that produces what some people, I mean, one famous economist also has written a book, mostly emphasizing on technology, but what he calls the great convergence. Let me say, I was thinking before, I'm going to talk about 5 grades. So the first one was the great divergence produced by the Industrial Revolution. And now what we are is what many people define as the great convergence. What we're seeing is per capita incomes are catching up in all these other parts of the world. The world is a lot more complex than what it used to be. In a way, I say it's like movement from the G7 to the G20. And that's happened in relatively few decades, even though we might think that has been underlying and has been a very important trend throughout. So in any case, these leads us to, for example, and then there's another great in there. Well, the Great Depression was a long time before, as we all know. And then there's suddenly the Great Recession, right? And the Great Recession is, 2008, 2009, big impact over the world. But the trend continued. The trend was still this underlying trend, which was the rise of all these other actors in the world and the relative lower weight of these very highly industrialized countries that were clearly, they represented more than 70% of the GDP for 4 decades, all the way to the 1990s. So I think that's a very important underlying trend. And then suddenly we get to the final great, the Great Lockdown. We'll see whether that's the name that will eventually remain, but people talk about Great Depression, the Great Recession, the Great Lockdown. Again, we could go on, but because of the limits of time, I just wanted to mention a few things. Clearly, this is the worst economic crisis that the world has seen, definitely for sure. Very little doubt right now that it's going to be more in economic terms, in terms of decrease of GDP, is going to be stronger than the Great Recession. Many people are comparing it with the Great Depression. We'll see. So now the question, of course, is what will happen now? We all know, I'm not going to devote much time to really explain what is happening now. We know the economic impact is very, very large. And of course, the crisis is moving, as many of the people who are here know, started on the east, started moving west, and it starts going south, and that's what we're seeing. So this is actually changing very, very, very rapidly, but it's clearly a health situation. Therefore, being a health situation could turn around, although I have some forecasts, but the IMF is really very pessimistic about the short run effect of this. It's going to be very important all around the world. And very few places of the world are going to be able to grow positively this year. China is one, India is another one. They're talking about 1.something% compared to the 8 or 9% that they were growing before. So clearly, this is a very important economic crisis. So let me now go to a little bit of the point. So given this introduction, but excuse me for making it long, but I really like the historical part, and I think it teaches us important things about the present and the future. So what do I think about the future? Well, I would say maybe 3 points. First, I don't think it will eventually, of course, there will be a lot of effects, and some of them very negative from a health situation, also economic situation, but I don't think it will dramatically change the direction of the world in terms of at least the economic part, which is the one that I can talk more because of my profession. But what I would say is it will probably go back to the trends. And therefore, I don't think there's anything that would make reversible the whole idea of this emerging world becoming more and more important, and the weight of all these other actors in the world become larger relative to the rest. Now, my second point is, what I'm a little more concerned is, it's again, and it's something that probably some other members of the panel will want to address. It's a little bit about globalization in general. So here, let me be very clear about being an economist. I believe, and I think many economists believe, that 2 of the main factors creating progress in humankind in history, and again, I go for centuries, would be first, technology for sure, and that's the example of the Industrial Revolution, but also the world we're living on today, but also free trade and globalization. And therefore, I do think free trade and globalization, with all its issues, and of course, one thing is the theory, another thing is the practice. but it has brought significant progress in humanity, and that's part of the whole process of emerging and developing countries becoming technological. One is technology, the other one is free trade. So I hope I am wrong, but I do believe we might see a backlash and going more towards protectionist policies. And that's just natural. When you have a lot of unemployed people, the first temptation is, why don't we substitute those imports? Why are we buying those products abroad? Why don't we produce them locally? And therefore, what I'm afraid, the same as it was during the Great Depression, is that we might start seeing already some protectionist tendencies in some countries. But I hope I'm wrong in a way, because I think that would be a mistake for humankind in general. And very last point, and this is a little bit outside of my area, but of course it also is about economics, is climate change. I do hope that if something, we can learn something from this crisis, is the whole discussion around climate change and how this is really, again, seems not to be about economics, but it's very much about economics. This is a negative externality worldwide that might create very negative effects for humankind as a whole, and therefore that's something that I would hope that this crisis will make us think and therefore act in the way of really avoiding the negative effects of these. Well, because of time, I'm going to stop here, but again, it's a pleasure to share with you these ideas. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gonzalo. So to summarize, so you think that the future, there won't dramatically be a change in economic direction. Globalization has seen significant progress, especially technology and free trade. You do think there might be a risk of backlash in terms of protectionism, which carries with it a whole load of other risks. We did see in the Great Depression what happened afterwards. And you're also concerned about climate change and perhaps thinking that this is an opportunity to seize in order to continue progress in that field. Thank you very much. We'll come back to what you've said later with some questions. And without further ado, we'll go on to Nigel Driffield. So Nigel, Professor of International Business at Warwick Business School, that's in Coventry. You also have a campus in the Shard in London. You're Deputy Pro-Vice Chancellor to Regional Engagement in the Midlands in the UK. You're the winner of Research and Teaching Awards. You've been a researcher and consultant for the UN, OECD, World Bank, European Commission, and the UK government. What else? Your research passions are firm strategy and location decisions and local influences in these. Talking earlier on this week, you're interested in the question, will the crisis affect or change corporate decisions to implant, set up supply chains? And the issue whether governments are making decisions according to populist agendas. So over to you, Nigel.
Okay. Thank you very much. Yeah, so I thought I'd just pick up on a few things that Gonzalo was talking about, really. As Thomas just said, my interest in this is I'm a professor of international business. So essentially, I study how firms make location decisions, why they choose to locate certain things where. And then in the context of that, then in this particular crisis, are we going to see a reversal of globalization as measured by that sort of relatively narrow metric of internationalization of business? So to go back to what Gonzalo was talking about, one of the things that we've seen probably in the last 20 years that has driven an awful lot of the political agenda, I think, in the West, is the number of secure industrial jobs in Europe and North America that have gone to Asia. And we can rehearse why firms have made those decisions. But I think, not just in the context of the current crisis, but I think it's also linked, forgive me for being slightly parochial for a moment, it's also linked, for example, to the Brexit vote, as well as probably the election of Trump. It's just the sheer scale of, high-paying jobs that have left the old world and gone to Asia. Also, in that context, again, to pick up on what's just been said, in the 1970s, roughly, exports accounted for about 10% of global GDP, and they are now at 25%. At the same time, the WTO is predicting that this crisis is going to lead to a fall in trade of about a third. So there is a huge chunk of GDP, which is not happening. So the question then is, I suppose, is how business is going to respond to that. Now, as again, Gonzalo said, essentially, the flow of goods is driven really by two things. It's driven by technology and price differentials, and everything else. You can talk about geography, you can talk about transport costs, everything else. But essentially, when you boil it down, the flow of goods or the flow of capital are really driven by technology and price differentials. If it's cheaper to make something somewhere else, then so be it. So I think the interesting question then is the extent to which this current crisis may change some of those underlying drivers. So for example, if we think about what's just been talked about as the sort of last 30 years or so of globalization, what that really means is firms reorganized production, and location advantage and firm level knowledge won out over economies of scale. There's a really easy example here, which is when the EU formed their single market, there were all these predictions that, for example, all cars would be made in Germany, all pharmaceuticals would be done in Holland, that economies of scale would win out. And actually, we saw the opposite, because individual locations have certain advantages and they then match up with firm level knowledge and technology. So we saw a reorganization of production and the lengthening of supply chains and the international division of labor. Now, the reversal of that is not trivial. Whatever you want to do, whoever you are, whatever you're seeking to achieve, the reversal of that long-term process is not trivial. Stating the obvious with apologies, firms basically make foreign investment decisions for one of four reasons. They're either looking for new customers, new technology, efficiency savings, or new resources. And that is not going to change. The drivers of those, however, might change a little bit. And to illustrate this, I'm just going to share, if I can remember how to do it, I'm just going to share one slide. Because the first time I saw this slide, I was kind of staggered. Ignore the ordering and just look at the scale on the left-hand side. What that basically is that is the amount of exports by each country that are imported first. So you can see, it's not surprising, New Zealand, probably the most isolated sort of developed economy in the world, is on the right, and somewhere like Luxembourg is on the left. But just look at the scale, the number of countries where getting on for 50% of their exports are imported first. So if we are going to see a sort of reversal in globalization, we have to see a reversal in a huge amount of activity. So what is then going to change? And I think one of the big changes may well be that as a result of this crisis, when it ends, an awful lot of firms are going to owe their governments money. And those governments want jobs, particularly those governments in Europe and in North America, they want jobs brought home. Okay? Post-2008, the number of firms in Europe who emphasized home production, made in Italy, became a real thing. The number of firms in the UK and Ireland who were advertising home-based call centers as opposed to Indian ones. It wasn't about the underlying economics or costs of this. It was about that being a way to connect to your customers. And we're seeing this already. France, Germany, Italy, Spain, plus of course Trump, who's been trying to do this for some time, using state aid in some sense or other to try to influence location decisions. Now, I can see the UK being particularly dominant in this, because one of the narratives is once we're outside EU state aid rules, we can do whatever we want. But actually, that's a misnomer. That we're seeing Macron, for example, saying, firms who want state aid to get out of this crisis are going to have to bring jobs back to France. So I can see that being that being one of the main outcomes of this. But just to then finish off, it's also worth thinking about what the barriers to that might be and what governments are going to have to do. So we're talking, as I said, about reversing an awful lot of globalization, shortening supply chains, moving activity. So governments are going to have to think about, okay, how do they unblock that? What sort of skills investment do they need at home? What sort of transport infrastructure? What sort of access to finance are they going to provide? What sort of support for innovation and exporting? What sort of higher skills, the commercialization of innovation, for example? And without governments doing that as well, then we might see a short-term blip in terms of a few jobs coming back, a bit like Trump's famous quotes that just made firms jump the Mexican border just to show that they were being patriotic. We might see a bit of that, but if governments want to do anything on a major scale, whether it's right or wrong, they're going to need to think about their internal infrastructure. And I think I shall stop there.
Right, thank you very much, Nigel. Yes, so some interesting points here. So the difference between exports countries, so back in the 70s, 10%, now up to a 25% level for countries. You mentioned that there will be, with the crisis, a huge chunk of GDP missing. And one of the questions to pose is the extent to which the crisis will change the way that globalization is happening. Change will come, firms will owe governments money, and governments, of course, will put pressure on firms in return for state aid to try to bring jobs back into the home country. And as you mentioned, we can see this happening in probably each of our own countries, the made in label and buy local, etc. And yeah, perhaps a question that we could raise again at the end is then what barriers will be before companies and governments in terms of what skills are needed, what kind of transport infrastructures, access to finance, etc. Thank you very much. Let's move on to Trinity. So Professor Dr. Louis Brennan. Louis, you're a professor of business studies. You're a senior research fellow at the Wong MNC Center in California. So that's a non-profit think tank. You're an award-winning international researcher. Your passions are mediating, shaping the future. You have a very interesting profile in that you've lived and worked in Asia, Australia, Europe, and the USA. And your research interests are in international business, global manufacturing and supply chains, technical management, and something I didn't quite understand, which is called business of space. But we'll talk about that another time. Over to you, Louis.
Okay, thank you very much, Tom, and good day to everybody. I'm not going to say good morning or good afternoon or good evening. I think if I say good day, it hopefully captures everybody around the world that's joined us here today. I want to take the time to address the issue of globalization. In particular, I want to consider what is happening in respect of globalization, given the onslaught of the pandemic and the vulnerabilities that it has exposed in the global system, particularly in respect of global supply chains. So is globalization stalling? Is it going into reverse? Are we already in the early stages of a period of deglobalization? So to consider these questions, I think it's important to first reflect on what was happening in the period immediately preceding BC or before COVID. So already in the years preceding COVID, we had been experiencing a slowing in the growth of global trade. Flows of foreign direct investment had not returned to their pre-global financial crisis peak. We've been hearing anecdotal accounts of reshoring and nearshoring occurring, and perhaps a shift in global supply chains from being global to being regional. The cost calculus for the global configuration of activities on the part of corporations was also in flux. This was due to a number of factors, including changes in transportation costs, heightened sensitivities to the environmental impact of carbon miles, increasing labor costs in emerging markets, particularly China, and advances in automation, robotics, 3D printing, and digital manufacturing. And superimposed on those changes were fundamental shifts taking place in the body politic of a number of Western countries, notably the US and the UK. In the US, the arrival of the Trump administration with its America First policy saw a reversal of decades of reduction in trade tariffs, with the imposition of tariffs on imports, notably from China into the USA, and America's walking away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was intended to open up trade between the US and 11 specific region countries, and from the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership involving the US and the EU. At the same time, the Brexit vote in the UK was a seismic reversal of a trend of increasing integration within Europe that had spanned a period of decades of the post-war years. And while many reasons can be advanced for those dramatic changes in politics affecting the process of globalization, globalization itself has frequently been identified as the driver of those shifts. And this is perhaps understandable. The benefits of globalization are diffuse, whether in the increase in living standards globally, the reduction in poverty involving hundreds of millions of people around the world, or in the greater availability of a host of products and services at competitive prices. However, the negative impacts of globalization tend to be concentrated, as in the case of the manufacturing sector in the USA, which on the one hand was severely impacted by the advent of low-cost competition from emerging economies, particularly China, and on the other hand by the outsourcing and offshoring of manufacturing activity to low-cost locations in the emerging world. Whereas one can argue that the latter phenomenon was driven by the pursuit of shareholder value to the detriment of other stakeholders, globalization was nevertheless its enabler, and hence the bet more as far as those impacted by the sizable amount of outsourcing and offshoring that took place since the 1990s. And hence the angst of recent years towards globalization and a reversal towards the embrace of national sovereignty. At the same time, the rise of China and its corporations has generated alarm in the developed world, with most developed economies taking increasing steps in recent times towards screening, regulating, and even preventing or prohibiting investment from Chinese firms. As China moves up the value chain, its firms, Huawei being a striking example, are being seen as more and more a threat to the established firms in the advanced world and to the commercial and technological dominance of the developed world. And perhaps most significantly of all, there is the incipient decoupling of China and the US. Now, arguably, the above trends have now been reinforced with the onslaught of the pandemic. Global supply chains operating as lean just-in-time systems and reliant on single sourcing have been seen as inherently fragile and highly vulnerable to shocks such as those produced by the pandemic. Designed to operate as efficiently as possible, they were left with no buffers due to their lean design and JIT operation, and with no redundancy due to the degree of single sourcing that prevailed. Little wonder then that many authorities, such as, for example, the EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, has been calling for less dependency and the restoration of strategic autonomy, particularly when it comes to sectors of national and public security. So we're likely to see, as a result of the pandemic, the deconstruction and reconstruction of supply chains. And while there is no doubt that some degree of retrenchment is not without merit, we need to be careful not to throw out the baby with the bathwater when it comes to globalization. In that respect, the case of Ireland, my own country, in relation to globalization is of interest. In my paper, Managing Globalization to National Advantage, the case of Ireland, I've argued that it's possible to embrace globalization and derive national success from doing so. However, that success is not assured, but depends on the deliberate and ongoing development and implementation of policies that can ensure that success. In Ireland's case, it pursued a policy, a consistent policy of openness and deeper integration into the world, whether through its progressive closer engagement with Europe through the European Union or its participation in global value chains. Furthermore, such policies are not static in nature, but must be constantly evolving. Thus, in the early days of global integration, It leveraged its position as a low-cost location to advantage, while at the same time investing aggressively in education to leverage the advantage of a qualified talent pool as its low-cost position eroded. Likewise, it has leveraged to advantage its geographic location, whether in relation to bridging Europe and the US or the time zones of North America and Asia. As well as leveraging economic and geographic factors, it also leveraged cultural factors, whether in relation to its English-speaking status or its vast global diaspora. Finally, it's been highly innovative in leveraging administrative factors to advantage, whether in relation to tax or regulation. It is noteworthy that while leveraging cultural, administrative, geographic, and economic factors to advantage over the decades, it continuously refines and innovates its value proposition. In that way, it has actively managed globalization to national advantage with a host of benefits resulting as a result, including higher standards of living, increased employment, moving from being a net exporter of people to experiencing net inward migration. As we respond to the vulnerabilities arising from the fragility of the current global system and that have been exposed by the onslaught of COVID-19, it's important to recognize that however imperfect globalization may be, nevertheless, it has the potential to generate benefits provided it is managed effectively. That has been the lesson of Ireland and one that we need to bear in mind for now and for the future. Looking to the here and now, Ireland has been, in common with the rest of the world, been greatly impacted by the pandemic. And while the health impact for Ireland has not been on the scale of that experienced by other countries, thanks to the proactive stance taken by the government and the health authorities, the economic impact has already been great. While the just released first quarter national accounts show GDP rose by 1.2% on the previous quarter and was up by 4.6% on an annual basis, and gross national product, which strips out the impact of multinational profit flows, rose by 0.1% in the first quarter and by 5.5% on the year. Current growth forecasts for the whole of 2020, when the full impact of the shutdown apply, are estimating that GDP will contract by over 10%. Meanwhile, unemployment, which is currently at 28%, however, it's forecast to drop sharply once the shutdown starts to ease. Still, the Irish economy is highly reliant on inflows of foreign direct investment. The fall in global foreign direct investment flows, which has already been experienced for the early months of this year, and which are expected to be of the order of 40% for the entire year, means that Ireland will be competing for foreign investment in a much smaller pool than in the past. At the same time, tourism, which has been brought to a standstill, and which is an important sector of the economy, cannot be expected to recover in the immediate future. And we have the spectre of a no-deal Brexit looming at the end of this calendar year. Were this to materialize, it would also impact on growth in the Irish economy in the years ahead. To summarize then, Ireland will continue to pursue a strategy of economic openness and integration with the rest of the world. In doing so, it will continue to innovate its value proposition so that it's best placed to take advantage of emerging opportunities while seeking to mitigate the risks that arise. Importantly, in contrast to the increasing unstable and apparently chaotic state of affairs in some other countries, Ireland has distinguished itself in recent years by the absence of the extreme polarization that has become the norm in many countries. That state of relative stability, entailing an abundance of social cohesion and social capital, will increasingly buttress Ireland's value proposition as a place to invest in and do business into the future. And that may well be the basis, the most assured basis, as far as Ireland's overcoming the COVID-19 shock and the worst case Brexit shock as well. So we'll leave it like there, and I look forward to the discussion that follows. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dwayne. Great. So You mentioned that the pandemic has reinforced trends that were happening before. You mentioned that there will be special impact on just-in-time, GIT and supply chains. There's likely to be, and this was an interesting point, you consider that there's likely to be deconstruction and then a reconstruction of supply chains. You mentioned that Ireland is a model in terms of how it's actually managed to successfully use globalization to increase not only its economic wealth, if you like, but also its soft power throughout the world. You seem to say that so the economy will probably, total GDP will reduce by 10% because of the pandemic. However, and problems related to foreign investment and also Brexit, the question, perhaps Nigel would like to talk about that at the end too. But you mentioned that Ireland has a specific model of stability and with a unique value proposition will continue in the future. That's a very upbeat message that you're giving to the world here. Thank you very much, Louis. Without further ado, then let's move on to André Guzzi, Professor André Guzzi, FGV-EAESP in Brazil. It's a very prestigious institution in Latin America and South America. You're a professor of political science and international relations. You studied and worked in the USA, including at the Center for International Politics in Washington. Interestingly, you've had field experience as a researcher and a consultant in Angola and Mozambique, and your passions and research focus on state building, post-conflict country development. We've touched base a couple of times on what you'd like to speak about. And Brazil is a very, very interesting case. The pandemic is happening at the same time as political instability. And there are some major questions concerning how your neighboring countries see Brazil, the question of inequalities, regional inequalities, and perhaps even we could add a little bit about the special model of social enterprise that is so important in Brazil and the role it plays. Over to you, André.
Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here to talk about the pandemic situation in Brazil. So in my presentation, I will address three aspects, as Tom has already mentioned. I will start talking about how the pandemic is worsening the socioeconomic inequalities in Brazil. Then I will talk about this political instability that is also overshadowing more effective solutions to respond to the crisis. And then I will briefly talk about the role of different actors, so international, other countries through international cooperations and the private sectors in order to respond to some of the problems we are facing now. So to start, Brazil has this contradiction of being an emerging country that increasingly has had a role in the economic, in the international economy. But when we look at domestically, it is one of the most unequal countries in the world, right? And in this population of 210 million people and a continental territory, we see very high levels of inequality in all different aspects of the society. So this is related to the levels of income of households, differences between urban and rural areas, gender-based inequality, race-based inequality, exclusion of indigenous populations. And all of these inequalities also are reflected in the access of public services in the country. So if we look at the poor population, we see that they have very limited access to health services, to clean water, and they live in very precarious situations. So just to give you a brief numbers, in 2017, we had 50 million people living under the poverty line. And in 2019, we had 38.4 million people with informal jobs, and 1/4 of the Brazilian population does not have access to the internet. So this leads to some problems during this period or this context of the pandemic. The first one is that the population will have, especially this poor population, will have difficulty in accessing health services, and they will also have a difficulty in respecting or following the isolation rules, right? They live in precarious conditions in their houses. So as I said before, some of them without access to clean water. They live in very small houses that is small even for a regular size of a family. And their informal jobs cannot be easily translated into a home office, right? So the opportunity of working at home is actually a privilege of some part of the population in Brazil, and it's not something for all. And this is not to say that it's only the poor population that is not following the rules of isolation in Brazil, but this is to highlight the fact that the reason why this population does not follow these rules is because of the structure or the conditions they have. And also, it is important to highlight because the government needs to take an action, taking into consideration these specific conditions that this population have. In terms of numbers related to COVID, yesterday it was announced that we now have 710,000 people infected and 37,000 deaths. So these numbers make Brazil now the epicenter of the crisis in Latin America. It makes Brazil the second largest country in the world in the numbers of infected people, and the third country in the world in the number of deaths. And in addition to that, given that there is not a nationwide testing program, it is unclear the accuracy of these numbers, and they are probably much bigger. And specialists are saying that we have not reached the peak yet, which will probably happen in July or August. So in some countries, we are still discussing the possibility of the new normal or the post-pandemic, whereas here in Brazil, we are still in the process of getting into this peak, even within all this very problematic situation. And another important aspect when we consider the COVID here in Brazil in this context of inequality is that many specialists are saying that most of the affected population or the greatest number of deaths will not exactly follow the same logic that happened in other countries where the elderly were the most affected, but actually in Brazil, the most affected will be the poorest population because they will not have access to the healthcare services in case they are infected. So this leads us to the second problem that I wanted to mention here, which is the political instability or the political crisis that we are facing today. In addition to the economic recession that we were facing even before the pandemic, we have now a government, a central government, that is neglecting the severity or the great effect of the pandemic. So the president of the government of Jair Bolsonaro is basically neglecting it, and who is taking the lead to promote the actions of isolation or quarantine are the state governors. So Brazil is a federal system. We have 26 different states plus the federal district, and it's these governors who are taking the measures in order to guarantee these restrictive rules in order to avoid the transmission. So this is the first problem that we have in terms of the political instability to deal with this case. The second one is that we also have problems related to the data, related to the infections and the deaths. because the central government is arguing that the states are inflating the numbers in order to have greater access to the resources that come from the central government. And this is a very current situation that is happening in Brazil. In fact, on Friday, the government just stopped putting on its official website the information about the infections and the number of deaths, saying that they are going to recount these numbers, but still they didn't say exactly how they're going to do that, because they want to analyze and understand if actually these numbers are being inflated. And then the third point related to political instability at this moment is that most of the debate about the pandemic always get into a very polarized political perspective. So those who are in favor of the central government are against the restrictive measures. And this, I mean, the population in general and the governors who ally with the central government. And then on the other hand, those who are against the central government are more in favor of the restrictive measures. So we see this polarization, and what we have as a consequence of this polarization is that the actions that needed to be taken now and take into consideration all these ideas of the inequality that we face in the country are basically being overshadowed by this political discussion and debate that the pandemic is now being the center of. So this leads to my third point, which is given this lack of attention from the central government to the pandemic, it is important to look at two other possibilities of actions and other actors involved. The first one that we could think about is international actions through international cooperation. But in order for cooperation to happen in one particular area, we needed to have first a government or a state that it took into consideration the severity of the crisis. So even though initially we saw that was basically a trend of the states, right, to deal with the pandemic, to look inwards, to resolve its domestic problems, we could see that throughout the time there was an increase in cooperation among countries. But Brazil was behind this cooperation because of its lack of attention given to the situation. But with that said, we do see some actions from particular countries that are donating money, resources, medical equipment to the country in order to respond to the pandemic crisis. But it's important to highlight here that these assistance or these donations from international actors, they are incremental to the actions that are taken by the political institutions. And then we also see a greater mobilization of private sector, so private companies and individuals who are donating, right, also money and equipment to address these issues. However, it's important to mention, and this is something that is being stated by the agencies that monitor the donations from the private sector, is that the richer states in Brazil, or where these companies are located, they are the ones that receive the greatest amount of private donations. So even in terms of donations in the private sector, we do notice in Brazil a certain kind of inequality that is being exacerbated due to the fact that this assistance is not evenly distributed within the territory. So as a conclusion, Brazil now faces a very complex situation because it adds to the present context the political and social problems that hinder the chance of advancing effective measures against the pandemic. International cooperation and private sector can represent important ways to respond to the pandemic. However, the most important actor is the government. With internal coordination among the entities of the federation, so the central government and the state government, and without a real recognition of the severity of the crisis by the central government, we will not see an effective solution to the problems we're facing today in the middle or in the long run. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, André. Yes. So it's true that perhaps many of us here in the more Western countries to Eastern countries to Brazil have actually forgotten what it's like to be in the center or you know, of the pandemic. So very, very interesting. Thank you, André. So particular situation concerning Brazil, with the central government kind of lacking in support to tackle the problem, the pandemic, and decentralized state governments actually taking the lead in this. Private sector help, but paradoxically enough, the biggest donations, equipment, etc., are coming from companies located in the richest states. So that necessarily means that the poorest people do not actually benefit from this type of donation. There is some type of international help as well, but international cooperation has been, according to André, hindered too by central government kind of relative inactivity. Cédomir, may I introduce you? And I think you've listened to the four speakers before you, and perhaps would like to rebound on some of the things that they said. Perhaps also focus a little bit on Singapore, which has also got quite an interesting situation, very reliant on international trade, amazing growth in the last 35 years or so to reach the top 10 economies worldwide. So you're Professor of Geopolitics at ESSEC Business School, and for 8 years you've been working on the ESSEC Asia-Pacific campus located in Singapore. You're a recognized expert in Islamic business and marketing too, and you're director of the EMBA, the ESSEC Mannheim EMBA on the Asia-Pacific campus. You're widely recognized in the APAC region. You have a regular TV spot with CNBC, and I've hardly ever written anyone who writes as many articles as you, so that's fantastic. We've heard of colleagues then. What would you have to add to this debate?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Tom, for the introduction. I didn't prepare any paper for this. I wanted to listen to my colleagues and to take inspiration from them. And luckily, I have plenty of inspiration, so I can talk for quite a long time. But due to time constraint, I will try to limit it a little bit. So I will not go in the chronological order. I will just pick up some ideas that were coming up. So the first idea that I was interested in, of course, is the nexus which exists between government and business. And practically all the participants are talking about this from different angles, but they are talking about that. One thing is protectionism. So I remember it was a few years back when Donald Trump has been elected, and when there was a Brexit, everyone was talking about the deglobalization at that time, and the only trade war was the trade war between the United States and China. And remarkably, the European countries, they did not want to be involved in this. They were just leaving Donald Trump to continue the trade war with China. They wanted to take both sides. And since Tom has indicated that I'm now living in Singapore, I will just refer to the latest article from the Prime Minister Lee. He has given an interview to the Foreign Policy magazine. So it was 2 days back. And he was talking about that, and he was very insisting on the fact that they don't want to choose. Many countries in the world, they don't want to choose between the United States and China because they see positive elements in cooperation with both. However, the situation is becoming so polarized that now it is pushing countries to choose. And it was interesting, and maybe Nigel will intervene on this, that the United Kingdom has shown a dramatic turn on this situation, that is the cooperation with China, would it be the 5G with Huawei or the situation in Hong Kong? Now, the United Kingdom is appearing to be practically on the same level in terms of narrative against China as the United States or Australia on the other side. So that's the first thing that I wanted to mention. In the past, it was only between the United States and China, but now it becomes China versus the rest of the world, because they're pushing the different countries in order to take sides. And the protectionism will undoubtedly focus on this, because every country will try to see what is its own, I would say, priority. And they have discovered, so I'm going back to the supply chain, which has been indicated by Luis, they have discovered that they were very dependent on China for many articles, especially concerning medicine. And this was like a shock. Of course, it was not a secret. Everybody knew that we are delocalizing to China so many productions. But from the political point of view, or from the media point of view, it was like a shock. They don't have masks. They don't have ventilators. They don't have anything. And they were saying, we have to wait that China is bringing this to us. So when André was talking about Brazil and was talking about countries helping Brazil, probably China was also sending something to Brazil in order to show a gesture of goodwill, in order to share the burden of the pandemic with everyone. And this protectionism, as Nigel was indicating, is about money and the countries, and we see this in France. The Minister of Economy, Bruno Le Maire, has indicated, we want to give you money in order to rescue you, but you have to give us something in exchange. And this something in exchange can be either to reshore and to come back, or to reorganize the supply chains and not to have a dependency on just one country, but you need to have some nodes that is different supply chains. And I will refer to the latest report by A.T. Kearney, because A.T. Kearney was talking about the reshoring, and they have come to the conclusion that today, in terms of supply chain, we have passed from cost to risk, and now the most important one is resilience. So resilience means that we need supply chains which will deliver, not necessarily just in time, but which will deliver. So I was talking with a certain number of people who are engaged in supply chain here in Singapore, and they are going back to the situation of stockpiling. So, Luis, if we talk about stockpiling, you will tell me we cannot have stockpiling with just-in-time delivery, with Kantai, etc., the Japanese approach. But now you have so many companies talking about stockpiling that they have a sentiment to, let's say, become young again, because we are talking about the way how we were manufacturing things, let's say 30 years back, and now we are rediscovering stockpiling as a very important thing, how to be resilient in this world. So all this is linked with the government approach, of course, linked with the supply chain. And I will go back for the final thing, because I don't want to take so much time, to René about to André about the situation that we have in Brazil, but it is the same situation that we have in other countries. That is, the pandemic has exacerbated inequalities everywhere. Even in, let's say, Western countries, we will have this distinction between essential activities and non-essential activities. So the essential activity is the person who has to go to the supermarket in order to sell us some food, the person who will work in telecommunication in order to have Netflix every day, or the person who is operating the metro or the public transportation. And all these people are not paid very well. And the persons who will work from home are usually the persons who are paid much better than these persons here. So now my question is, what is essential? Is it the guy who is operating the metro, or is it the person who can work from home? And will the companies also take this into account? Will they requalify what is essential and what is not? And how can we pay these people differently? So I will just finish with what Gonzalo was talking about, because he was giving us a broad, let's say, historical perspective about what happened, especially the globalization, which lifted up poverty in the whole world. So now the question is, if I have a question for Gonzalo, every time that we have a crisis, we are saying we will never do the same thing again. So that's the mantra, you know, and we have seen this mantra so many times that I'm just wondering, is this the same thing that is a mantra that we'll repeat, or will we change definitely? If we change definitely, the climate change that Gonzalo has talking about is a very important one, because just before the pandemic, all the companies were piling the signatures for the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Maybe you remember this. This was the great thing that everyone was talking about. And suddenly with the pandemic, we forget about that. So maybe we will not go back to the normal situation before. What is the new normal? Nobody knows, but let's see what you have to say about that. So I'm now leaving to Tom and to all my dear participants the possibility to exchange a little bit on these issues. Tom, it's up to you.
Yes, thanks very much, Cédomir. Very, very interesting stuff. So reshoring, the interesting points about resilience in the supply chain. We now need supply chains that are strong and have their kind of key their key mission in mind, which is simply delivering things. You mentioned that just in time is now changing towards stockpiling, a notion which existed about 30 years ago when most of us were young whippersnappers. It's coming back, and that the COVID or the pandemic has highlighted the inequalities that do exist in society. It has, however, served to identify the essential and non-essential kind of people or trades, if you like. And an interesting question that perhaps one of the professors, faculty can answer is, will companies actually take this into account, this essential and non-essential workforce, and will, for example, salaries or wages change as a result? And also the important question about climate change. Maybe we can ask the question to Gonzalo about the supply chain or essential and non-essential people, and then we'll tackle a couple of very, very interesting questions that the audience has in fact sent in. Is that okay with you?
Sure. Well, I think so many very interesting issues have been raised that, of course, I won't be able to address all of them, but fantastic points. So really very interesting. Now, in relation to these, I mean, again, I'm not the expert on supply chain, but something to being a macro person, I've seen more the changes in relation to free trade versus protectionism. And that goes back to one of the points that was raised, and the world, sometimes we think that maybe this is the first time we're in a free trade world, but that's not the case. Really, there was something that some historians call the Pax Britannica. And Pax Britannica was when Britain was the world power, and all the way from the Battle of Waterloo all the way to the First World War, it was very much a free trade world. And then the war and the crisis moved us back to a very protectionist time for a while. The highest increase on tariffs that happened right after the Great Depression. So going back to the question of whether we will solve these now, my feeling is, despite, and I said that before, despite all the limitations of free trade, I think free trade, again, in the world in which we live, or relative free trade, has brought significant advances for humanity as a whole, with all the issues that might be. So going back to the point that Cédomir was saying, I think that's what I was saying in the beginning, I'm afraid we will fall into the same mistake again. And therefore, because I do believe in that many of the other people talked about it in different ways. And of course, and I completely agree, Trump was already there and Brexit was already there before. In fact, the IMF has been saying, let's be careful with self-inflicted wounds since 2016, they were saying. And those self-inflicted wounds were there before the crisis. So I'm afraid about that. Now, just interesting, and again, we have people who are more expert on supply chain management, but I was reading an article the other day on the Financial Times about how people are starting to talk about something that they call, and I wrote it down here, I remember, open strategic autonomy. But it seems like a contradiction, right? But I mean, probably makes sense. So it's open because you still want to believe on free trade, but there's strategic autonomy, which is kind of, well, let's stockpile or let's, so that's where we are. Probably I would think the solution is not either we will go to fully free trade, no discussion, or a fully protectionist, no discussion. And just last point in relation to that, I do agree. One thing that does concern me a lot is what some people are called decoupling between China and the United States and forcing many other countries to take a position in there. I mean, Europe itself is in a very uncomfortable position. As you know, Singapore, again, I'm not surprised. Singapore is the first investor, is the United States, and the first trade partner is China. So in a way, how do you have to choose between these two? So again, going to that supply chain, I think but I do find some changes on the supply chain in the sense of, as it was mentioned before, trying to secure your supply chains in these, but again, I'm more of a macro person, so I'm sure other colleagues can probably expand on that.
Thank you, Gonzalo. And anything to add to that, Nigel? And then we'll tackle one of the questions from the audience.
I don't think, I think one of the interesting things in the UK is maybe people from outside don't recognize just what a populist government we have. That, you know, for example, when you have a situation where the wife of effectively the deputy prime minister, who is also one of the most high profile journalists we have, tweets, soon made in China will become a badge of shame in the UK. And she tweets that from her iPhone. And it actually says at the bottom of the tweet, from iOS on from Twitter on an iPhone. That's kind of an indication, I think, of where the UK is, that at the moment we have to blame somebody for the problem that we're in. So let's blame China. Now, the whole 5G thing and Huawei and whatever was bubbling under anyway. And it's also wrapped up in, for people outside the UK, we're in the process of building a large train line called HS2 that's going to kind of link London and the north. And it's wrapped up in how many of those contracts Chinese firms are going to get. And that there's an awful lot of stuff about China bubbling up in the UK. But a lot of it is linked to this sort of populist narrative, unfortunately. I mean, personally, would I have concerns about our 5G network being largely owned or to an extent owned by Huawei? Yes, I probably would. But that's independent of the fact that COVID started in China, whereas that's what we have. On the supply chain thing more generally, I think what's interesting, and I'd be interested in other perspectives from other parts of the world, is some elements of UK supply chains were able to move very quickly. So the ability for certain firms, for example, to produce ventilators could actually move really quickly. And I work with a professor of supply chain management on these kind of issues at Warwick. And some elements were able to transition really quickly and repurpose and make stuff, whereas largely the sort of PPE provision wasn't, because we do not have sort of large scale sort of textile businesses in the UK. So it's interesting how some elements were able to transition and some weren't.
Great, thank you very much. I propose a question from the audience, and maybe we can spend like 1-2 minutes max. There are some very interesting things here. The first one came up, so it's a potluck. So do you think that these protectionist strategies will somehow boost entrepreneurship? So will protectionism actually boost on entrepreneurship?
No.
No. Okay. That was a quick answer.
I agree. No.
Yeah, so the brief explanation, Nigel, please.
I assume the argument is that if we focus on doing stuff ourselves, then there will be opportunities for small firms to fill gaps from stuff we used to import and so on. I think Cédomir made an interesting point before about this is as much about risk as anything else. I mean, one of the things that interests me in the context, for example, of reshoring is, and I've waited to find empirical evidence of this, but I've talked to firms who tell me that one of the big drivers of kind of reshoring 10, 15 years ago was when suddenly the insurance premium for sailing a whole load of stuff past the Horn of Africa suddenly zoomed up, because you were kind of going to have to sail it past all the Somalian pirates. So suddenly, if you're a German firm, making stuff in Poland makes a whole lot more sense. And it's got nothing to do with geopolitics or anything. It's to do with insurance costs and, as Cédomir said, risk. Now, if we are just going to say, right, we are going to try to repatriate supply chains to the UK, then in the absence of policies around support for small firms, support for innovation, support for what is usually referred to as kind of related and unrelated variety, that is technology spillovers and learning between sectors, we would need to do a whole load of that as well, rather than just hope that small firms will spring up to fill gaps.
Thank you. Okay, so someone sent in a question that's maybe difficult to answer, but it's an interesting one. So the person said, I see that there's a question about war here, or a risk, or even an idea of war. But don't you think that all the global cooperation has increased in the last few months? That we're in fact moving away from armed conflict towards a much more shared and peaceful world? Cédomir, perhaps? Yeah, so has global cooperation actually reduced the threat of potential conflict coming from protectionism?
I think that André can jump in for this question concerning the international cooperation, because he just indicated at the end of his presentation the cooperation between the international cooperation and the private sector. And we just mentioned this. What do we mean by international cooperation? Is it government to government? Is it NGOs? Is it private companies? So we have a lot of different actors who can intervene there. And what is interesting is to see the private sector, because the private sector always says, this pandemic is not our problem. It is the problem for the governments. They have to solve this. But that's not true, because they employ people and they have to provide essential goods for the population. So they are very much involved in this. So André, for you, this international cooperation, how do you see this?
Yeah, in terms of relations of countries and the cooperation that is increasing nowadays, the way that I see is that it improves the possibilities of identifying common solutions for common problems. But this is an advance that doesn't necessarily translate into a reduction of the possibility of war. And then one important aspect that we needed to take into consideration when we talk about that is, what are the new threats that the world is going to face nowadays? So now the cooperation will probably increase the ties of countries, but now the threat is not something that is state-based, right? It's more of, you know, a disease or a virus that is out there, and how this is going to shape the relations of countries and how this can actually boost even more the likelihood of war is something that we still need to wait to see.
Can I just say, Tom, in terms of the question about cooperation, to me, it seems that cooperation is fundamentally dependent on the local, and by which I mean that the national state. So what we've seen over recent years, we've seen at the national local level increased polarization. And my observation would be that when you have heightened polarization and intense polarization at the local national level, that it doesn't promote or facilitate or encourage cooperation, international cooperation. So I think that suggests to me that the discussion we had earlier in terms of inequality and so on, that's a key piece. That if we want to try and reduce that polarization, that a focus on inequality at local and national level is very important. And if you reduce local and national polarization, I think you will get greater international cooperation. But to me, the real obstacle at the moment to international cooperation is the local and national polarization.
Yeah. That I mean that makes a terrible sense. We all seem to understand that it's important to cooperate internationally, that it's important as well for bringing people up from the poverty line, increasing standards of living. So our populations are intelligent populations. So why do they vote, or why do they go to the other side towards the guys who are shouting out, "Hey, let's buy made in so and so. Let's be protectionist"? Why can't people actually see very clearly what's going on? Who will answer that killer question? Yes.
I will, if you want, in the context of what we're seeing in the UK. Essentially, it's the difference between social benefit and private benefit. It's exactly the same as my family historically come from an area which voted strongly for Brexit. And if I try, and for example, so one of the dominant narratives has been the extent to which EU workers have, coming into the UK, caused a reduction in earnings for ordinary people in the UK. And I can point to any amount of evidence, any number of labour market economists who will say the effect of immigration on earnings is tiny. It's at most kind of like 0.01% sort of thing. But I'm not a carpet fitter who saw my earnings decline because 16 Polish carpet fitters set up in the town that I'm in. And so I can talk about the social benefit and the aggregate, advantages of having more carpet fitters and being able to do it cheaper and so on and so on. But I'm not the carpet fitter who lost my job.
I think also there's the question of social media. And when you ask why is it that people cannot see, clearly and so on, I think social media brings a huge distortion. And in the absence of any, let's face it, any regulation of social media, social media inherently is distorting, and is designed to be distorting, because the more distorting it becomes, the greater the number of eyeballs, the greater the number of people that sign up, the greater the retention of people on social media. So it's a real issue, I think, in terms of reducing that heightened polarization within communities and within countries.
If I may add, just agreeing with what has been mentioned, I also think that there's another element, and I would argue that many countries and governments, but not only governments, economists, politicians, we have not been very good at telling people some of the benefits that globalization has brought, for example, for the whole world. There are groups, of course, there's always groups and sectors that lose. So the problem is, because we have not communicated so well, it's easier to find the guilty part. So who's guilty? So it's the immigrants are the guilty ones, so China is the guilty one. And that tends to unite. If you have a polarized population, and everybody's looking for a reason, and therefore many people would tend to agree with that kind of easy story of the guilty are these other people, no? And that's dangerous, I think, over medium.
Thank you very much. Yes. Let's move on to one. This is an interesting one. So, what do you think of repatriation missions? A large part of the expat workforce is repatriating to home countries And this could lead to a saturation of population in countries like China and India. Would people be as willing to emigrate, or employees invest in expat workforce? So will the repatriation of large quantities of foreign nationals actually exacerbate the problem in countries like China and India? That's a big, big question. Two big countries.
I will, if you don't mind, because this is a very difficult question here in Singapore, because we have a very large expat population living in Singapore. And the problem was that the number of cases of the pandemic, of the virus that we have in Singapore, is attributed to this expat population. That is the so-called foreign workers that we have here. And we had this also in the Middle East. If you go to Qatar, if you go to Dubai, if you go to any of the countries which are located in the Gulf, which also have a very high expatriate population, mainly coming from India, but it can be Bangladesh, it can be Pakistan. So they are all concentrated there. And since they live in conditions which are not made for the local population, it means that they are living in rooms where you are packing double-decker beds, and when you are putting, let's say, 20 persons in one room, and you will have one shower, and you will have one toilet for this room of 20 persons. This is I would say, the worst situation that we can have concerning the spread of the disease. If you are going back to Brazil, and if you are going to the favelas or to other places in Brazil, where you also have packet people living there, how can they implement social distancing? How can they wash their hands frequently when they don't have access to the clean water, and so on and so on? So it means that this expat population is sometimes seen as the guilty one, as Gonzalo has indicated. So the disease is coming from them. And in the past, in the Middle Ages or before, it was a common thing. We always have identified one population with a specific disease, and we are saying this is the population which is responsible for everything. But here in Singapore, they have made, I would say, a revolutionary approach. The revolutionary approach is that the Prime Minister appears on TV and says, we will protect our foreign workers. The term our is very important, because in that case, you're not making a distinction between domestic population and the foreign population. And this is going against all the tradition that we used to have, because as you know, the foreign population was usually the invisible population. Even if they're working in essential activities, people did not look at them. But today, they are looking at them and they want to preserve them because they know they cannot live without them. Who is going to work? You go to Qatar, practically 94% of population is a foreign one. Who is going to work there if you don't have this foreign population living there? So this question about the expats is a very difficult one, because you can be tempted to make them guilty for everything. At the same time, you need them. So we'll see in the next months how they are going to address this population.
Can I
Next
add
question.
one point?
Oh, sorry. No, go ahead, André.
Yes, no, very quickly, but I just wanted to point out also the fact that the borders are closed in South America, the great movement of refugees and migrants, for example, from Venezuela, that used to have access to Colombia or Brazil, the territory, at least to go to work or have access to services. Now they don't have it anymore. So this is causing a humanitarian crisis also in these regions. There are some international actors are trying to support them within the Venezuelan territory, but it's important to consider that this logic of crossing borders doesn't exist anymore. And as a consequence of this, it also impacts the remittances, that this population used to send to their families that stayed in these countries. So this dynamic of the pandemic will affect a lot this situation of these migrant movements of populations who fled their countries because of these political instabilities.
On the question concerning the borders, sorry to jump up, a question for Louis. If we have this border between the UK and Ireland, and if I'm not mistaken, the UK has implemented this quarantine of 14 days for everyone entering the UK. Does it apply to the Irish people?
My understanding is that it does. I mean, I have a niece who's been resident in London for the past year, who's returning her to Ireland at the end of this month. And my understanding is she will have to spend 14 days in quarantine on her return. So I think it works both ways at the moment. Yeah.
Okay. Tom,
yes,
not to interrupt, I'm just looking at time.
Yes.
How are we on this?
That's a very good question. Yeah, I was about to say that certain people present, certain gentlemen have to actually go, Nigel mainly. So we've got about 5 minutes left. We've overrun the time, but it's been such an interesting debate that we could say 5 minutes. Nigel, I think you have to leave immediately, don't you?
No, 5 minutes is fine.
All right, great. Thank you very much. Lovely. Gentlemen, would you like to take advantage of the last 5 minutes to actually wrap up and perhaps give an overriding message?
That would be great, but I would prefer that every one of the participants here is giving a last thought. And this is how we are going. And maybe at the end, I will take 1 minute. Since we have very dear colleagues here, I would like to give to them the possibility to talk. I won't ask who is the oldest one, but I know maybe who is the youngest one. So André, I presume that you are the youngest one. So final thoughts for you, but you have just 1 minute for that.
Well, I think the conversation was very interesting. It's always very good to look outside of the region, your country, and think of comparative actions and ways that other countries are responding to the pandemic. And I think that this kind of debate is an opportunity for us to look at particular measures that are being implemented. So I think that this is an important exercise that the academia is doing consistently. And I think it would be interesting also for the government to take this kind of action and look to other solutions that we see worldwide and that were successful to implement in the country as well. So thanks for the debate.
Thank you, André. Who wants to be next?
Nigel, yeah.
No volunteers. Nigel?
I think in summary, I think the fundamental drivers of why firms engage in foreign investment or trade will not change. You know, it's either driven by efficiency or new markets or resources or technology. So that won't change. If governments want to try to influence that, then coming back to what I think was said about Ireland, that governments need to then think what their value proposition to the world is. And if your value proposition to international firms is that you are going to be more protectionist, then that might work in the short term in terms of giving them large grants or whatever it is. But in the long term, businesses that by definition want to move people around, I noticed there were quite a few questions around labour mobility. One of the things that firms want to do is they want to be able to move people. You know, if you have a need, if you're a multinational firm and you have a need for an engineer in Vienna and your nearest engineer is in Berlin, you just want to send them. You don't want to waste time getting visas or whatever. You just want to send people. If you need a lawyer in New York, you just want to put one on a flight in London. You don't want to get a visa first. And And governments need to recognize that this protectionism works both ways, that they can't just try and build a wall around businesses that they've got and then assume that they'll stay. Because if you put frictions in the way, businesses will find other ways of doing it. And as we've seen, other ways of doing it typically mean doing it somewhere where you can be more flexible.
Louis.
Yeah, well, again, thanks to everybody for a very stimulating discussion and much food for thought there. I think if I reflect on the discussion, the point that comes to my mind that I think emerges as key is around underpinning values. For example, if we talk about supply chains, the driver of the configuration of supply chains over the past several decades has been efficiency. And as we've seen with the pandemic, supply chains designed and operated on the basis of the value of efficiency come up short when it comes to shocks, when it comes to fundamental shifts and so forth. And so we're seeing a movement from efficiency being the overriding value to consideration of resilience, of effectiveness, if you will. Likewise, when we talk about essential, non-essential workers and the divide between these two, particularly in terms of conditions and in terms of remuneration, fundamentally, it comes back to a question of values. So I think the great opportunity and the great question at the moment in this era of the pandemic and the post-pandemic world is, will it drive us to embrace a more inclusive set of values that has benefits for a wider number of people, for a wider spread of the world? Or will we retain the values that have prevailed over the past several decades? And I think in that context, then we're all from business schools. I think we should be thinking in terms of the values that we espouse, that we articulate, that we seek to inculcate into our students in our various programs.
Right, yeah, very inspiring message there. Gonzalo.
Yeah, I'll try to be very brief because I think very many interesting things have been raised already. So I would just say a couple of things. First, clearly, as was also mentioned, this is a very dramatic humanitarian, and I couldn't agree more, André, with what you were saying about, and I'm particularly concerned looking at the numbers, not only about Brazil, but also Mexico, India, and other parts of the world where again, the capability of fighting against both on the health infrastructure, but also the resources the governments can put in order to try to compensate for the negative effects are significantly lower. No? And again, going back to the previous point just mentioned, I hope that once this is over, we will go back, that's my hope, to again, a world where we look for multilateral conversations, for opening, for trading, and all those principles and all those values that I think have helped, and against sustainability and hopefully dealing with climate change. So that's clearly my hope. I'm a little worried that maybe some of these things will not happen because of the tensions created by the economic crisis in particular, which tends to, but I hope I'm wrong. Anyway, we'll see in the future what happens.
Thank you, Gonzalo. And the final word then from Cédomir.
Thank you, Tom. I was very delighted to have you all during this conversation. Again, the name of our cooperation is Council on Business and Society. And I think that we covered both aspects here, business and society. So we had people who are economists, international trade specialists, operation management, politics, etc. So it is not usual that we have this kind of panel that is a little bit diversified panel. We are all coming from business school, so usually people accuse us to only look for profit, but that is not true. We also have the human part, the ethical part that we are teaching to our students. So I'm just referring to what Luis has said at the end concerning the inspiration and management. What do we teach as a value? Because we are coming from some of the most important business schools, and probably our students will become very important. This is what we hope for them. So how are they going to do? How are they going to behave when they finish our school? So we'll just leave this for the end. I would like to thank very much Tom for his brilliant intercession here between all of the people that we have. Also to the technical part for ESSEC and Florian. He is not here on the mosaic, but he was here before. So I would like to thank again every one of you, each and every one of you. This was very interesting for my part. Hope we will have some more in the future, and hope to see you very soon in the future, if not on Zoom, in that case, preferably face-to-face, and to have a drink. So I think that someone already started this before, so we can continue with another drink after that. See you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Yes.